the biggest model I've ever built. This 1:1 scale Tiger 1 shell. Stay tuned and I'll tell you all about it. Bob Johnson with PK&W Model Works coming at you with another video. This time about how I built this pig model. Yes, that's the name of the manufacturer. Pig, P-I-G model. 1:1 scale Tiger 1 shell. Now first, a little bit about the Tiger. It's obviously one of the more popular tanks of World War II. Who wouldn't want to have a model of the shell that was fired from that tank? Lots of models were made of this, and they continue to be made of the Tiger 1. It's just a aggressive looking beast. Now the 88mm main gun on the Tiger 1 was derived from the 88mm Flak weapon system. So as you can see on the B-roll here, the Germans had made quite a bit of shells during the war, and third up from the bottom is the armor-piercing 88mm round that this model represents. Now, I wasn't 100% sure, and I'm still not 100% sure about the accuracy of this model. First, the base of the shell shows that it's a Flak casing, F-L-A-K, Flak casing. And I expected it to say that it was a KWK shell, Kampfwagenkanon, or tank cannon round. And there certainly are rounds so designated. But I saw another source that indicated that there were only 3 types of 88 casings used by the Germans during the war, 2 of which were labeled Flak, and the other was the KW-43 casing used on the Tiger II, which is much larger. So that might be accurate. The other thing that kind of worried me was the stenciling here, which showed 1941, September 1941, which was essentially a year before the Tiger 1 went into production. And certainly armor-piercing rounds were used on the field pieces very successfully, starting in North Africa. So, you know, is this a model of the shell that was used in the field piece as opposed to what was used in the Tiger? Could the Tiger fire the same AP round as the AP round in the field piece? I don't know, but I do know that it came out really uber cool, and it's a great thing to have. So I really highly recommend you getting and making this model or one of the other pig models, which they have the Tiger II shell, they have the Soviet shell of the period. They may have other things, but I'm a Tiger 1 fanboy, so I had to have the Tiger 1 shell. That was it. So I ordered this. I had to order this from Australia. I could not find this kit available anywhere in the United States, and so it took 3 weeks for it to arrive from Australia, and I was super impatient during that time period. I was like Ralphie on the Christmas Story, waiting for his secret decoder ring from Orphan Annie. Every day I was checking the mail. I mean, it's pretty unseemly for someone my age, but I was so excited to get this kit and to build it. Here's the huge box that it came in, and here I am holding the pieces together, the unfinished pieces together, just so you get an idea of what the starting point was. There are plenty of unboxing videos about this kit on the internet. I'm not going to show you that. And a lot of them do point out the sanding that's required, but I'm going to spend a lot more time in the painting and stenciling, the masking that's required, just so you get a sense of how to get this project done. Now, as is pointed out in other videos, the biggest flaw in the model is this divot at the tip of the projectile. I started sanding with 20 grit sandpaper, and there's a seam that runs on both sides of the casing as well as both sides of the projectile, and that divot is on both sides of the tip of the projectile. So it takes a lot of work. I probably sanded for 2 hours on this thing, and it still wasn't really exactly the way I would have liked it at the end of the day. I started with 200 grit sandpaper and then moved up to 440, and I finished off with 1000 grit. When you think you've sanded enough, keep sanding. That's all I can tell you. In terms of filling the divot, I started with some Vallejo putty, and that worked okay as a first coat, but I could see I was going to have to put multiple coats on, and it didn't look like it was going to be as hard and as non-porous as the surrounding surfaces, so I switched over to using some gap filling CA, and that worked great. 1 or 2 coats of that, and sanded that off, and it was really nice. The tip came out great. Now the base of the shell, they said to apply it with CA. I thought I could do it with some regular plastic cement because I glued a piece of sprue to the bottom of the base, and it seemed to go on just fine. It seemed like the base was melting and the sprue. However, so I did that, and I put the toolbox on top of the shell casing to kind of hold it down while it dried. But it didn't hold very well when I started adding weights to the casing, and I did add some lead weights and other things to the casing to give it some heft. The base broke right off, so I ended up using CA after all. I highly recommend putting some weights in the case before you start the painting process because it's a long, tall object. It could fall over, blow over. If you've got some weight in the base, it's not going to move around. It makes the project a lot easier to complete. And I use rattle cans for most of the painting on this, and I started with Montana Black's primer, which went on clear to my surprise. It shouldn't have been a surprise because the top of the can is clear. So then I applied brass. I used Krylon brass for this, and it just looked too dark to me over that black base. So I came back and I just used some Montana Black white, and I painted the entire casing white, and I also painted the tip of the projectile white because it's ultimately going to be white. And I painted the silver, what I'll call compression bands here around the base of the projectile. I painted that area white as well because I really like the way silver snaps when it's painted over a white primer. I then took the Krylon and I painted the casing 2 coats with the brass, and boy, it really came out nicely, and you can see a few shots in the B-roll of that. Now there's also a primer that goes on the bottom of the base of the shell in the center, and I just painted that a darker silver. I had a couple of different silver cans, and so I painted that a darker silver and glued it in the bottom. No fuss, no muss, no bother. Then I masked off the projectile. After I'd painted the tip white, as you can see here, I then masked off the tip of the projectile so I could paint the projectile black, and I also very carefully masked off the compression bands. It's probably not what they're called, but I'm going to call them compression bands. Carefully masked those off so that I could paint black around them, including in the little groove in between the bands. Unfortunately, when I pulled off the masking on the bands, it pulled off a lot of silver paint. It was a complete disaster. The tip came out great, pulled the mask off no problem, relatively straight. I had to touch it up one place with a brush. Came out great. The bands just got torn up when I pulled the masking off, and I was using sensitive surface frog tape, but it still pulled right off. So I had to hand paint those areas where the black was showing through. And I also had to hand paint around the bands themselves to make that line even. And so I used a thin down black paint to flow into that edge in order to give it a crisp edge, just yet let gravity help me. And that came out pretty well, but it was time consuming and tedious. And I'd spent a lot of time masking that turned out to be lost and wasted time. If you know what I did wrong and a better way to mask, please tell me something in the comments. I look forward to your help. One of the coolest things about this project is the stenciling and the markings that are visible there. Pig Model provides stencils on a kind of crisp plastic, and where that plastic folds over around the curve of the surface of the shell, particularly where it's a smaller diameter like the tip, the number 28 on the tip, some parts of the stencil don't really follow the curve. They stick out proud, and they would allow a lot of bleeding when you're painting. And so what I did was I used some adhesive from a glue stick, and I just took that on the tip of a scalpel and put it inside there and actually glued those areas down a little bit. I didn't go crazy with it, but enough to make it follow the curve a little more closely. I used my airbrush, and I was very careful about the angle of attack of how I was brushing so that I wasn't blowing air up underneath the stencil. And it came out great. Since there were 3 different colors to do, this white, FES, then the red, and then black here on the bottom of the casing, I did it in that order, white, red, black, so I didn't have to totally clean up my airbrush. Cleaned it out, but I didn't have to get it completely clean because I was going to a darker color. So I started with the white, I then covered that over with some paper, and then I sprayed the red. I had some dark red Montana black spray paint available to decant into my airbrush to do the red. And then I cleaned the brush again and I did the black. And I gotta say, the stenciling came out great. It's a really important part of the project and it looks fantastic. A couple of my weights came loose. So be careful when you do that. If I had to do it again, I would probably, after putting the weights in, fill this entire casing with some of that gap filling foam or something like that, so that the weights would, there would be no chance for the weights to move around inside the casing. I did try to distribute. I put some weights here in the center section of the shell, a little bit at the tip, because I thought if people were holding it lengthwise, it might want to flip onto its base if I only had weight here in the base. This is still a delicate model. I painted it with, again, as I said, the Montana Black primer. And then even this brass, though, that's a Krylon, kind of a standard enamel, kind of plasticky paint, is still fragile. I thought that maybe the acetone-based lacquers from Montana Black would be, maybe that's why it was delicate, but I really don't think that's it. I think the underlying plastic flexes a little bit, and this is a model you're going to want to touch and handle. So it's really a shame that it isn't a little more robust, but it is a little bit delicate. In fact, the base of the model very quickly chipped in between coats, and so I put some feet on it. I had some clear plastic feet, but you're going to want to put something felt or something on there to protect the paint on the base. I put a varnish between coats, and it is ultimately finished with a lacquer, clear lacquer, but several coats of clear lacquer, actually semi-gloss, to give it kind of a slightly metallic look. A really awesome model. I highly recommend it, and I hope you enjoyed seeing my process for painting this amazing model from Pig Model. Until next time, this is Bob Johnson with PK&W Model Works signing off. Keep on modeling.